In this module, I'd like to talk about an idea called innovation tournaments. This idea comes from the book by the same name that I wrote with my colleague Christian Tervish. All of the ideas are in the book, but I'm going to take this opportunity to give you just the top level ideas as related to design. The first thing I want to do is distinguish between innovation and design. I define innovation as a new match between a solution and a need. So if you think conceptually here in this diagram about the targets being the needs and the solutions being the arrows, then what innovation does is it results in a new match between solution and need. Now, if you think about the target as a gap and the arrow as an artifact, then arguably design results in innovation. So our definition of design is conceiving and giving form to artifacts that solve problems. And certainly it's reasonable to think of that gap as the need and the artifact as the solution, and design proceeds from need to solution, and in that sense is definitely innovation. The distinction then is really that innovation may result from other approaches to finding matches between solutions and needs. So for instance, in innovation, one might begin with the solution and then identify a need that solution addresses. That, for instance, is what happened with the creation of Teflon or polytetrafluoroethylene. That was an accidental discovery of a new molecular compound, and then DuPont proceeded to identify needs that solution might address. We wouldn't normally think of that as design. All right, so I want to use an example to illustrate the key idea of an innovation tournament. This is the Oral-B cross-action toothbrush that was developed by Lunar Design and the company Oral-B, as well as some others. And you might look at this toothbrush, which was wildly successful commercially, and say that elegant form was the result of the brilliant work of a creative designer. Well, that is true, but I want to illustrate in a little more detail how that form actually came about. Lunar identified several hundred possible handle concepts and articulated them through pencil sketches of those concepts. They then took the 2 or 3 dozen most promising of those concepts and created balsa foam models of those shapes, much as we did, or as I did, or illustrated in our prototyping module for the ice cream scoop. The design team then tried these various forms in their hand and identified the 5 forms that were most promising and that felt the best. Those 5 forms were then made using the production intent materials, that is the plastics and the polymers, the elastomers and the thermoplastics that were intended to be used in the final product, and made these 5 prototypes. These 5 prototypes were then tested with consumers, and this alternative in the middle was identified as the one that best met the customer needs and best closed the gap. Now, if you think about that overall design process, it has the structure of a tournament. A large number of what I call opportunities, in this case design concepts, were identified from the outset through an exploration process, and then through a series of development steps and filters, those few hundred raw ideas were eventually reduced to, in this case, one exceptional opportunity, the form that became the cross-action. Now, this certainly is familiar to all of you now that you've been engaged in the design process, but it's useful, I think, to think about it slightly more generally and to think about the structure of an innovation tournament and, in fact, how you can improve the performance of that tournament structure. Now, innovation tournaments are used in all kinds of design domains. So here's another example from Lunar, which is the development of the TerraPass graphic identity. TerraPass is a company that I founded, and Lunar did the graphic design and the graphic identity for that TerraPass brand. And you can see here in this tournament process, Lunar identified several hundred graphic design concepts. They then created these few dozen that were actually rendered using an illustration tool made a little bit more formal. And then these few dozen were considered by the entrepreneurial team that founded TerraPass, and we identified these two here as the most promising, these kind of cyclical concepts, the kind of yin and yang of TerraPass that symbolically represented in some ways what the TerraPass business was about. And we asked Lunar to then further refine that concept direction, which they did, and which concepts are shown here. So these 7 concepts were the result of further refinement of this basic concept direction. And then these were then tested with a sample of users and then further elaborated in order to create this final concept here, which became the identity for the brand, and in fact is even today the identity for that brand almost 10 years later. So that's an illustration of this same tournament approach as applied to the development of graphic identity as opposed to the development of a product. Now, tournaments are of course not limited to design. The tournament structure is also the process that a pharmaceutical company goes through to identify a new drug. So for instance, this illustrates the development of Zocor, which is known generically as Simvastatin, which is a product created and marketed by the pharmaceutical company Merck. In this case, Zocor was identified through a tournament process from 10,000 newly discovered or synthesized molecular entities. In fact, if you imagine, I shaded it just a slightly different color there, that's Zocor. That is, by the way, 10,000 circles. And so you see conceptually the challenge of tournaments, which is how do you identify the exceptional opportunity, in this case Zocor, while not going out of business because of the cost and expense of looking at all these other alternatives. In the pharmaceutical industry, they use a multi-stage process of screening and evaluation in order to winnow, on average, 10,000 compounds into one new drug. Now, not all tournaments are closed tournaments, as shown with the Oral-B example, the graphic identity example, and the Zocor example. Some tournaments are open tournaments, meaning that the opportunities that are identified by the public at large through the willingness of participants to join the tournament. So for instance, this is the pop singer Kelly Clarkson, who became a fantastically successful commercial artist as a result of winning the American Idol singing competition. Now, in essentially every country from which you all are represented, you have your own version of Idol, but this was the first season of American Idol, and it identified Kelly Clarkson as the winning contestant. Now, you think that pharmaceutical companies have long odds in terms of the number of molecular compounds that are screened in order to identify one successful drug. But the Idol competitions have even greater odds, or have even longer odds. So this is a photograph of Petco Stadium in San Diego, where the American Idol auditions were held during one season. And you can see here thousands of people in the stadium waiting to line up to go to visit with producers and to do a short audition before they even get the possibility of being on the actual show itself. Indeed, in the open tournament American Idol, the filter ratio is about 200,000 or 300,000 contestants for every one eventual winner. There are many interesting tournaments in the world of design, and I'm not going to go through all these examples, but I'm going to point you to some other tournaments that you might find very interesting. There are open design tournaments in the area of graphics. One example of such tournament site that runs these contests is a company called 99 Designs. You should check out their website. It's a very interesting forum in which hundreds of designers compete in order to solve graphic design problems. In the area of apparel, the company Threadless runs tournaments to identify new t-shirt designs. You might find that one very interesting. The company Quirky.com, runs innovation tournaments in order to identify new consumer products. And the nonprofit organization, the X Prize Foundation, runs tournaments in order to solve major societal challenges such as automobile fuel efficiency, commercial space travel, and so forth. So anyway, I encourage you to look at some of these sites and to think about in what way you can use tournaments in order to identify exceptional opportunities in the field of design.